It's a fanciful vision, to be totally honest. And there's also a real question of why would we want autarky, right? I mean, if we truly had, say, let's say even Trump had the power to say these tariffs are definitely going to be in place for 20 years, which he doesn't, right? Because the Republicans could lose their congressional majority in a year and a half, and we could have a Democratic president in 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So, but let's say he could, right? What would we get, right? We'd get significantly higher prices. So inflation. We'd get slower economic growth. And, of course, we'd start getting shortages, right? I mean, like we had during the COVID pandemic, where we couldn't actually buy the things that we wanted. Because, as you said, if JLR actually were to do this, it would take 5 to 10 years for them to, build new factories in the United States. So I think that they're living in a bit of a fantasy land, to be honest. And my hope and intention, or my expectation, rather, is that in the coming months, they'll sort of see reality.
For the first time since World War II, the United States has chosen to turn away from global economic cooperation and has picked up the path of protectionism. President Trump's tariff announcement on Wednesday may have something of a shock to the US allies, but it's also just one more example of the meteoric rise of economic warfare in the last few decades. Now, my next guest has been tracking this trend. Edward Fishman is the adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and former State Department and Treasury Department official whose very timely book, I have to say, is called Chokepoints. And I'm delighted to say he's in the studio with me now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Alexis, thanks for having me on today.
Edward, I mean, talk about timing. My goodness. Your book, Chokepoints, How the Global Economy Became a Weapon of War, is exactly what happened on Wednesday.
I think that's right. And look,
did you know this was coming?
I wish I could say, that I had a crystal ball. If so, we'd be doing very well economically in my family. Look, I think that we've seen a trend over the last 20, 25 years in which the United States has been deploying economic warfare more and more and more. It's been an exponential trend that really started during George W. Bush's presidency, carried on through Obama, Trump, and then Biden. I think what's new today, Alexis, it's not so much that the U.S. is waging economic warfare. It's not that we're using tariff sanctions and export controls. Every government's been doing this recently. Other countries are doing it. The thing that's different is that Trump is waging economic warfare not just against our adversaries, not just against the Chinas and Russias of the world, but everyone, including our closest allies, including the UK, including Europe, including Japan. So that's what's novel today, but it is part of a broader trend, and that's why I decided to write the book Chokepoints.
I mean, there's so many questions, and a lot of questions that you touch upon in the book. What do you think is behind what happened on Wednesday? And I asked this question, a lot of people say that Donald Trump is a transactional president, right? He loves a deal. He loves making a deal. Let's make a deal. But some people are saying perhaps this is not about deal making. Perhaps this is Trump being a transformational president. Perhaps he really does believe that he wants to restart the factories, the car factories in Detroit, the steel works, the Rust Belt to actually stop being rusty and start being shiny again. What do you think is behind it?
So there are very few things, Alexis, that Donald Trump is consistent on. One of them is that he loves tariffs. I mean, going back even to the 1980s when he was a real estate executive in New York.
He wrote a New Yorker piece, didn't he?
He wrote a New York Times piece about why tariffs are great and that we should be putting more tariffs on Japan, because at the time, Japan was the rising economic power and the U.S. was running a big trade deficit with Japan. The thing that he's been less consistent on, though, is why he loves tariffs, right? So we know he knows he loves them, but he changes his mind about the reason. And there are really three distinct reasons that he's put forward. One is that tariffs can raise revenue for the government. And there's a vision that Trump has that tariffs could replace the income tax in the United States. And by the way, early in American history, back to George Washington, we didn't have an income tax, and the government did raise money by tariffs. Mind you, at the time, the U.S. government was tiny, right? It was all fit in one office building, basically. So I don't think that's a particularly realistic use of tariffs today. Another one that Trump talks about is sort of what you just said, which is protecting domestic industries, trying to onshore manufacturing, bring back jobs from abroad. But then there's also a third justification. And if you look at what he actually put forward in the executive order that imposed these tariffs a few days ago, it's really based on national security. It's based on this idea that we need to be using tariffs to advance our geopolitical interests against other countries. And when you think about it in those terms, it really is more of a tool of deal making, that he's going to take these tariffs and go to the Mexicans and get the Mexicans both to lower their tariffs and put more troops on the U.S.-Mexico border, or use the tariffs to get the Europeans to shoulder more of the defense burden in Europe. Basically, this all-purpose negotiating tool. The problem, though, is you can't do all three of those at once. And in some ways, they work at cross purposes, right? Because if you want to use tariffs as a negotiating tool, you got to be ready to lift them. But on the other hand, if you want to use tariffs to bring back jobs to the U.S., they got to be in place for decades, or else U.S. companies aren't going to make the investments that actually bring back factories from China to America.
Or JLR, who we heard today, Jaguar Land Rover, who've ceased trading cars to the U.S. They've announced. The choice that Trump is offering them said, hey, if you don't want tariffs, come and build a factory here in America, and then your cars will be tariff-free. Well, JLR are not going to do that right now until they have a little bit more certainty, building a factory, I'm sure, to produce cars solely in the US. I mean, not even Teslas are solely produced in the US. A lot of their parts come from across. How does this make sense? Because in order for this to work, it's going to take a decade, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a fanciful vision, to be totally honest. And there's also a real question of why would we want autarky, right? I mean, if we truly had, let's say even Trump had the power to say these tariffs are definitely going to be in place for 20 years, which he doesn't, right? Because the Republicans could lose their congressional majority in a year and a half, and we could have a Democratic president in 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So, but let's say he could, right? What would we get, right? We'd get significantly higher prices. So inflation. We'd get slower economic growth. And, of course, we'd start getting shortages, right? I mean, like we had during the COVID pandemic, where we couldn't actually buy the things that we wanted. Because, as you said, if JLR actually were to do this, it would take 5 to 10 years for them to, build new factories in the United States. So I think that they're living in a bit of a fantasy land, to be honest. And my hope and intention, or my expectation, rather, is that in the coming months, they'll sort of see reality, because I don't think that even his own base is going to be very happy when their retirement portfolios are drying up and, their employers are laying off workers left and right.
Because you have to assume, we were talking about this in the news break, that some of those workers who are going to be laid off were Trump voters.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, we've had $6 trillion in stock market losses in the last 48 hours. So, I mean, if those kind of hits, right, I mean, do you think anyone's going to be hiring? If anything, companies all across the board in the U.S. are going to be tightening their belts. So these are the types of economic pain that really is going to be broadly felt, right? No one is really sheltered from it.
Edward, in your previous role as a State Department and Treasury Department official, what's going on in those departments right now? I mean, Trump likes to do business with his gang in the Oval Office, but what's happening in those departments right now? Are you still in touch with people who are still in those departments?
Very much so, yes.
And what's going on?
And look, I think that Trump is a bit of an unusual president in that he runs the government with quite a bit of a long leash for these people. So what you wind up seeing, and this is something I document in detail in Chokepoints, because I've got 100 pages on Trump's China policy during his first term. And basically the way he runs the government is he kind of allows these factions to duke it out. You have different sort of interest groups within the government who have their own pet policies that sometimes clash with each other. And then they wait for the moment when Trump is in the mindset to align with them, when his mood is to be tough on China, and then they give him a tough on China policy that he signs off on. Or if he's, Xi Jinping just, complimented him in the press, they give him, the China doves give him a policy to sign off on. So these folks are working. They're putting things together. I think the thing that's a little bit different this time, even from the first term, is there's a lot more fear, because you have this different element, which is Doge and Elon Musk, breaking into these government buildings and basically firing workers left and right. Oh, 100%. And look, there are, what I will say, and this, I don't know if this has been covered well in the UK, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, there are a handful of the top sort of cabinet officials who have resisted Doge, right? So the State Department, the Treasury Department have not fired the probationary employees, the employees who have been hired in the last 2 years. So they've resisted the orders of Elon Musk. And by the way, Elon Musk does not have an official government role. So it's very much within Rubio and Bessent's authority to resist what Musk is telling them to do.
Looking forwards, and you describe beautifully in the book how that sort of global economy, and I suppose this is what makes everything different. Trump keeps looking back at McKinley and the raising of the tariffs, and then sort of talking about post-war. But I mean, post-war, there were very few countries able to produce anything apart from America, which is why America became that industrial giant that it was. But things are different now. Looking at where we are now, what does your gut tell you? There are certain people who spoke to a professor earlier saying what we could see the EU, Canada, some other emerging economies, maybe even China, but let's leave them out of it for now, saying, look, we're going to reduce trade tariffs between ourselves to take away the impact of the US tariffs. We're going to make, trading as flawless and as easy as possible between us, and we'll let America do their own thing. I mean, because that's kind of going back to your book. That's the global economy sort of being used as a weapon against America.
Yes, I think that's very possible. And one thing I did as sort of when I got to the end of writing my book, I had to think across the story and analyze why has there been this exponential rise in economic warfare. And I came up with kind of a simple structural explanation, which is that the global economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, but we're living in this period of intensifying geopolitical rivalry. I think where we were headed during the Biden years was this notion of basically two big economic blocks. One that was the democracies with the US, Europe, Japan, et cetera, and another that was really led by China.
Yeah.
I think where Trump has us going in is something that's a lot more chaotic, where maybe America stands apart. America is more autarchical. China, may have its own bloc. And then there's a real question, I think, here in the UK, in Europe, and Canada. Are those countries now going to form their own sort of separate bloc, maybe a third bloc that's apart from the US and apart from China? Or is it going to be more like every nation for itself? And frankly, even as an American, I think we'd be better off in a world where the other democracies outside the US do come closer together. Because what we've seen throughout history is when states are all in it for themselves, when you have autarky everywhere, you find things like imperialism and war going way up. Because you don't feel confident that you can buy resources abroad. You feel like you sometimes have to go conquer them and plant the flag. And so I do worry that if we don't handle this right, we could easily slip our way back into a world of military warfare instead of economic warfare.
And I mean, again, as you point out in the book, the whole point of the trade part is you tend to not wage war on the countries that you do great trade with. But that seems to now be going a little bit out the window, that is a distinct possibility.
Very much so. And I think one of the things that is the most sort of confusing, frankly, about Trump's tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, is, Trump was the one who initially really started this strategy of trying to isolate China and bring along American allies to isolate China. But look at the tariffs on countries like Vietnam. They're higher than the ones put on China. Japan is being tariffed. South Korea is being tariffed. So, I mean, it's hard for the United States to ask Tokyo and Seoul to align with Washington against Beijing if they're also getting tariffed by the United States, right?
I mean, it's a massive opportunity for China, is it not?
Very much so. And I heard that you're going to do a segment on this. Is it tomorrow?
Yeah.
I think it's a very important topic because I know that in the UK, this was, there's been a flip-flop, right? I mean, you go back 10 years ago, it was the golden age of British-Chinese relations, right? And then Trump, pushed the Brits to drop Huawei and to really come on board with a more tough policy. Obviously, the Chinese did things like, trample on democratic freedoms in Hong Kong. And so there are other reasons for it. But, I mean, if I were in Britain, I would imagine that it's tough to feel like you can just fully rely on the United States right now. And when you have the world's second biggest economy right there, I mean, it's hard to be set apart from both of them.
Edward, I feel we can talk for another hour on this. There's so much covered in this book. It really is. You go into so much detail and it explains so much about how the world works around us with the economic rules we've set for ourselves. Highly recommended. Chokepoints, it's out now. How the global economy became a weapon of war. I hope we get to speak again because I know we're going to have a lot to talk about. Edward.
I'd love that. That would be great.
Great stuff. Thank you and good to see you. Edward Fishman there. The book is called Chokepoints.